Well, the attack in Moscow comes at a very bizarre moment, the exact moment, of course, when Congress was just about to vote on a $1.2 trillion budget that very mysteriously had no money for Ukraine in it, but it did have tons of money for Israel and LGBTQ plus causes, as well as cataloging and monitoring cattle in the United States using digital identification, but no money for Ukraine. So all of this comes at a very interesting moment. Just put a pin in that for a moment. We'll talk more about it in a second. Following, of course, the terror attack in Moscow that killed 137 people, including 4 children, the gloves are now off overnight. Russia's launched a series of major attacks in buildings in downtown Kyiv, hitting Ukrainian security service buildings. That's been confirmed on the Ukrainian side. Russia's also struck energy infrastructure. And according to reports this morning, Poland has activated its air force because of concern over Western Ukraine under heavy bombardment. So are we entering a new phase? And are the gloves off for President Putin? There's been a lot of criticism, of course, of Putin that maybe things have gone a little too slowly on his side. Colonel Douglas MacGregor is a former Pentagon advisor to Donald Trump. He's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. And in moments like this, there's no one I'd rather turn to make sense of this craziness than Colonel MacGregor, whose vast combat experience and Pentagon experience could speak volumes for us. Colonel, great to see you as always.
Sure, good to see you, Morris.
So let's talk about what your initial response is to this. It seems like the West was quick to jump on the idea that this was ISIS, and even other newspapers out of Australia were saying, don't believe anything Putin says. Clearly, this was Putin that launched this attack, just like he blew up his own Nord Stream pipeline. Just like any other attack that happens in Moscow, he's dropping drones on his own residential buildings. So this was Putin. What did you make of the initial response to this and now Putin's response in the immediate aftermath?
Well, understanding the Western commentary and response, and actually the event itself, requires that you understand 2 key points right now that most people in the West are not getting. The first is that Zelensky and his regime is the equivalent of a fatally wounded animal that is dying. And as a result, it will strike out with whatever it has to the bitter end at this point, rather than essentially surrender, give up, and negotiate. So think of Zelensky's regime as a dying entity. Will grasp at anything he can find. He has no real capability left on the ground. He can barely defend what he's got on the ground. And so he's turning to other forms of action, like this terrorist attack, or the use of more drones against Russian targets in Russia itself. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that NATO is in complete disarray. Behind the scenes, people are panicking. They know the war is lost. That's been clear for a long time now. You'll remember when we talked last year about the NATO summit in Lithuania, in Vilnius, and no one would speak to Zelensky. Zelensky was essentially given the cold shoulder because they viewed him as the individual who'd lied to them about his ability to be successful and defeat the Russians. And in truth, they'd all been lying to themselves from day one. And we, of course, have helped this along by promising the world and delivering nothing. I think the best way to look at it is we promised mountains and delivered a molehill. So the NATO itself is in disarray. All you have to do is look at this man, Macron. Imagine Washington is the leader of NATO, and Macron steps onto the stage and tells everyone France will fight the Russians in Ukraine effectively, which of course is absurd. He hasn't got more than 7,700 ready French troops that he can send anywhere in the world, let alone Ukraine. He promises 20,000. He's trying to build that up, but it's not likely to get very far. And then he's backed down from those initial statements saying, well, they'll be in a non-combat role. So NATO itself is in disarray. The Germans have disavowed him and said, no, forget it. We will not participate on the ground in Ukraine under any circumstances. And of course, our newest members, the Finns and the Swedes, are falling all over themselves to send thousands of troops to fight in Russia, aren't they? Answer is no, no one is. Macron is entirely alone, and our forces are sitting in Poland and Romania doing whatever they do while expensive bases are erected there for U.S. comfort. This is a disaster for NATO. So understand everything that's happening right now against those 2 facts. Zelensky is finished. His regime is dying. NATO is in disarray, has no leadership, and is afraid to admit the obvious that everyone knows privately the war is completely lost. So those two things have to be understood. Now, let's look at the event that occurred itself in Russia. Out of the blue, we have people who are ostensibly Central Asian Muslims, Turkic Muslims. We know of one that was a Tajik. It may be that they're all Tajiks. The Tajiks are a people that live north of Afghanistan. They're unique in Central Asia because they speak a brand of Farsi or Persian, which is kind of unusual. Everyone else speaks what we call Turkic, almost the same thing you hear in Istanbul. So that's kind of interesting. We know that the Ukrainians have recruited many of these people to fight inside the Ukrainian army. We have evidence that some of these people have been part of the Ukrainian army. Out of the blue, these people go into Russia, which sounds impossible, but you have to understand the 1,000+ miles of border that you cannot possibly protect effectively if you're a Russian right now. So these people get into Russia. They go to an arms cache, which is being prepared for them somewhere. They've obviously had some training. They show up and murder people in Moscow, and then miraculously they attempt to retreat along exactly the same route they took to get in there from Ukraine. What are we seeing? We're seeing rank amateurism. These people are not professionals. They're thugs who were offered a lot of money to go in and do this. They talked themselves into it. They went in. Most of them are dead or captured. I don't know if anybody got back into Ukraine. But the last thing you do if you're a professional is take the same route out that you took in on the mission. Now, the man that was captured that's got most of the attention is, of course, the gentleman who's lost his ear at this point. The Spetsnaz unit that captured him and his friends work for General Kadyrov. They are Chechens. And so they sliced off this man's ear at some point. Whether or not it was already partially injured and they decided to tear it off, who knows? The Russians, of course, were not pleased with this and immediately said, what are you doing to these people? Do not mistreat them, et cetera, et cetera. So then the question was asked, who among you sliced off this man's ear? And the group collectively all stood there and said, I did. In other words, they wouldn't give up the individual. Right. Now, all of this has worked to Putin's advantage in a dramatic way. The Russian people are infuriated. They're angry. They want blood. The emotions in Russia are running very, very high. And there are people in the Duma who are telling Putin publicly and privately, you need to crush Ukraine. You need to end this once and for all. And if anybody gets in your way from the West, the hell with it. We'll just march in there too. Putin is not an emotional actor. He's very rational. He's very thoughtful. He's very deliberate. He's not going to be rushed into this thing. But clearly, once the ground dries out in Ukraine, and that's going to happen towards the end of April, latest beginning of May, I think you're going to see major movements to include crossing the Dnieper River and moving south to take Odessa, and probably movements up north to complete the conquest of Kharkov and perhaps run right up to the river in immediate proximity to Kiev. I wouldn't be surprised because the pressure is now on to end this thing. We have offered nothing. We refuse to negotiate. We treat the Russians as though they're responsible for this disaster when in fact we ourselves have brought this on ourselves. You know, this is the hell of our own making. No one wants to take credit for it. I am glad that people on the Hill are now questioning the wisdom of sending any more money over there because we don't even have any idea how many billions of dollars have simply been stolen and ended up in bank accounts. Remember, Ukraine continues to wallow in the worst sort of corruption. They make Mexico look like an advanced economy. That's how bad it is. So this thing is nearing its end, its final moment. No one is going to take Putin on. We're not going to go to war in Ukraine over this. This is just not going to happen. But we're going to continue to talk. The media is going to continue to lie, with the exception of people like you and Tucker and a few others, and say that Ukraine is winning and the Russians are running out of steam. It's all nonsense. This thing is almost over.
One really important piece of this is something that you tweeted or posted on X after this happened. You said, there is little doubt that MI6 and CIA were involved in this. So what's the end game for them, right? Congress is withholding aid money for Ukraine. Ukraine tells Le Monde Le Monde posts a piece saying, Ukraine is shocked that we're not giving them $60 billion. CIA and MI6 are actively involved in this terror plot inside of Moscow. What is the goal for the intelligence community in Washington, do you think?
Well, the CIA has been a rogue organization for a long time. Some people say it went rogue in the 60s. I can't pinpoint it, but it's clearly a world unto itself. They're going to continue to try and create plans that will allow them to pinprick the Russians whenever the opportunity presents itself. MI6 is deeply embedded with the Ukrainians. The British, ultimately, far more so than we are in terms of advice and support and training. I imagine that these people were given some training by them on the ground before they went in, although I doubt very seriously they expected much more to happen than has. At the end of the day, these institutions are going to continue to plug away, harm Russia, attack Russia, undermine Russia in any way they possibly can until someone in Washington says stop. Thus far, we've seen no evidence for that. We haven't seen any evidence for leadership of any kind. We just are treated to a barrage of remarks. Oh, we hate Russia. Russia's evil. Russia's bad. They can't win. We'll win. Ukraine will win. It's all nonsense. There's no leadership. No one is in command, to answer your question. That's our big problem in the West right now. There is no strategy. There is no plan, nothing. It's all disjointed, fragmented, and ineffective.
Something has stood out to me. I have a couple more questions for you, Colonel, but just the moment here, right? You see Germany lights up all of their buildings. They light up the Brandenburg Gate with different tragedies, the flags of different countries that have been through mass shootings and so forth and tragedies. And the Brandenburg Gate is completely just barren of any lights of Russia, nothing. They're not showing anything. President Putin flew to Ground Zero in New York and wrote on the wall and laid flowers after the 9/11 attacks and offered condolences for what happened. I don't think there's been any response from Washington to Putin offering condolences or the White House sending any sort of anything on that side, right? I mean, have you heard anything from your side that the Biden administration has reached out?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, supposedly we've said that we're displeased by it or horrified in some cases. I'm being told in the State Department, but in reality, no. Frankly speaking, this regime that we are living under with the Biden administration is so ideologically driven that as far as they are concerned, anything that harms Russia is morally justified. Remember that these are globalists. Now, globalism is a strange word, but what it really means is the following. Either you agree with our agenda, everything from LGBTQ, the destruction of the family, the elimination of religion, the enactment of atheism, go through all of this sort of thing. Either you agree with us or you're the enemy. And the good guys are the people who live inside what we call the liberal international order, which is all democratic,
Right.
that respects human rights, but locks people up from January the 6th for years without any trial. But we're the good guys. We respect human rights and democracy. Everyone who's not part of the liberal international order is an authoritarian and hence bad. And Putin is an authoritarian. I can't conceive of anything more authoritarian than the current government we have right now that'll be delighted to put you in jail if you try to protect our borders, that wants to wage war on the governor of Texas and the Texas National Guard to keep the borders open to facilitate the invasion, to bring lots of people like the ones who just committed the atrocity in Moscow into the United States. So this all makes no sense. But in their world, in the bubble that is Washington, some people call it Versailles on the Potomac, they live in this bubble and they believe that they're right and everyone else is wrong. Well, this isn't going to last. This is doomed. It doesn't matter what happens in November, it's over for them. So they too are much like Zelensky. They're striking out. That's all they know how to do. But there is no strategy. There is no rational calculus at all. If there were, why would anybody leave our borders open at all?
It's incredibly infuriating what's happening at our southern border. And Colonel, when you look at today, you see France raising their terror alert to the highest level. There's concern reports that the United States could be facing similar terror attacks like the one that we just saw in Moscow because of our open border. I mean, reports are upwards of 42 to, I've seen even 42 to 45 million illegal aliens in the United States, a majority of which are single men. And what's your concern about the potential for these style attacks in the United States?
I think they've been very highly probable for a long time. First of all, Hezbollah has always had a large chapter in Mexico. So I'm sure there are lots of Hezbollah cells operating all across the United States. There are ISIS types down there as well. There's a huge Chinese embassy with all sorts of connections to the cartels. So nothing would surprise me at this point. And I think we've got to get ready for it. We don't know when it will happen and how it will happen, but I think it's almost a certainty, not just because of what's happening in Ukraine, but of course what's happening in Israel. We keep saying that we're providing the Israelis with what they need to defend themselves. Well, the last time I looked, annihilating a population and destroying its homes and driving hundreds of thousands of people to starvation doesn't usually qualify as defense. But that seems to have eluded people in Washington. So I would expect lots of activity here inside the United States. I just don't know when and where, but it's inevitable.
Yeah, I think you're right. Inevitable is the key word. I'll get you out of here on this, Colonel. Obviously, we saw some major attacks over the past 24 hours in Western Ukraine, in Kyiv specifically, also, and on energy infrastructure, SBU buildings targeted. Do you think that the sort of Russian response is going to wait till late April when the ground firms up, as you said, or are we going to see strategic attacks over the next few days and coming weeks?
Well, the missile strikes that you're referring to blackened 4 major cities in Ukraine, essentially knocked out the power infrastructure and destroyed much of the energy infrastructure. I think we're going to see more of that. Those are preparatory strikes. But you can't move on the ground very far, very fast right now. The ground is muddy, and it doesn't support significant forces moving on the ground. And you can send a few people forward on foot, but that's a slow and unrewarding activity, as the Ukrainians have found out. So you've got to prepare things. I think we'll see more attacks on the air defense infrastructure, even though most of it is destroyed at this point. Air and missile defense continues to be a big issue. The Russians want to eliminate it. Once they're confident that they've eliminated those things and the ground is solid, they will move. And I'm sure they will move to the Dnieper. And I think before the end of the summer, Odessa will also be in their hands. The key thing here for us to understand is if foolishly someone intervenes for whatever reason in Western Ukraine, let's assume the Poles are dumb enough to cross the border and go into Lvov, or the Romanians through Moldova do something, the response from the Russians will be an annihilating one. They will spare no method whatsoever to deal with these people. The other thing is, if we get involved, if we think we're going to support somebody with air power only, we will be declared a co-belligerent by the Russians, along with everybody else in Europe. These people are furious. They've had it. They're angry. Putin is the rational actor in Russia. That's what people don't get. This man's very deliberate. He's holding the horses back. But at some point, he's got to let the reins loose, or he's going to have a population not angry with him, but will just overwhelm the situation and demand action. That's what we don't understand. He's not at risk. We are very much at risk right now.
Actually, I'll get you out of here on this question. This has been bothering me for months, which is the United States has special forces in Ukraine. The French do. The British do. We've heard, of course, from the Russians that if the Americans put forces in Ukraine, this would be a bridge too far, right? This would, as you say, they would be seen as a belligerent army, and they would not hold back anymore. So we already know that we're operating there. Can you explain that that paradox to me?
Sure. Well, you've got light forces that are designed to advise and train and then operate complex equipment. In other words, you've got people sitting at computer terminals linking our satellite-based arrays to the Ukrainian intelligence apparatus, That's the way we're operating. What we don't have on the ground, and what is absolutely intolerable for the Russians, is the presence of combat formations, large units. The 7,700 that the French can deploy to a place like Romania, if they were to cross into Ukraine, that would be seen as an attempt to seize terrain, to hold terrain, and consequently challenge Russia's dominance in its backyard. That will precipitate a war. But small numbers of people there to advise me. Everybody does this. The Russians have done these things. The Chinese have done some of these things. Everybody has at some point. They're not tripwires. It's a modest commitment by international standards. So what people look for are the major formations, the combat units, a core headquarters that is controlling large numbers of forces that suddenly cross the border. That's what the Russians will not tolerate. Now, they have killed large numbers of NATO personnel, including our own. We don't admit to it. We keep it quiet, but they have killed large numbers of us. At some point, I'm sure that truth will come out.
How do families keep that quiet? How do we keep that quiet among American families that American forces have died in Ukraine and we don't hear anything about it in the American media?
Well, I don't know how the Americans do it, but I know how the others do it. And they pay a handsome sum of money to the people who've sustained the loss and told them, under no circumstances do you go public about any of this, certainly not as long as we're engaged over there. But here's this amount of money. We're sorry for your loss. And these are the benefits. And they'll probably hand over some decorations for the individual that the individual never actually saw himself. This is the kind of thing that goes on. So I don't know what we do in the United States, but I suspect it's probably somewhat similar.
Colonel Douglas MacGregor, as always, we appreciate it. Our Country, Our Choice. Can you tell our audience, by the way, it's been a few months since we've reminded our audience what Our Country, Our Choice is all about, because it's not just about talking, it's about taking action. How can people actually take action and take back our government?
Right. Well, Our Country, Our Choice is founded by a group of people that decided it didn't matter who you voted for in the United States, you got the same policy outcomes over and over and over again. So this is an attempt to essentially unite people across party lines and build the foundation for what I would call a third way, and ultimately, at some point in the distant future, a third party. Because we see no future with the two orthodox organizations that are almost indistinguishable from each other, uncomfortably close. We call it the uniparty on the Hill. And this, at the same time, the people that are joining us, we're trying to recruit people who can go in to government and replace the people in the bureaucracy and in Washington who are running the show. In other words, we want to go in and drain the swamp, not sort of metaphorically, in reality. And like Andrew Jackson, we believe that any decent, honorable American who loves his country with a modicum of education is better than anyone we have right now in Washington.
Absolutely. The website is ourcountryourchoice.com. You can go there and support the cause, something we believe in wholeheartedly here on Redacted. Colonel, great to see you as always. Thank you for making sense of this craziness.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Good to see you again, Clayton.
Thanks so much, Colonel. Appreciate it. And, we just had this. This is an amazing piece of news just this afternoon. You have that CIA asset, Budanov, who, of course, is the Ukrainian security head. And he just did an interview and was asked about the terrorist attack in Moscow and, smiling, happy about it. So listen to this, and asked to respond. Does he want to see more of these types of attacks on civilians, because they love attacking civilians? Watch this.
What's your reaction to it, even if you don't claim responsibility?
I'm very glad to see this.
Yeah.
That's my reaction.
That's your reaction. You're happy to see it happen.
Yeah.
Do you think there'll be more?
I think so.
Inside Russia? Deep inside Russia?
Deeper and deeper.
Deeper and deeper inside Russia. More terrorist attacks coming.
I just wish more people were aware that the civilians of a country aren't the ones that are attacking you.
Right.
It's that easy. They're not the ones doing it.
And of course, Ukraine has been attacking civilians for over a decade in the Donbass. And so what was Eastern Ukraine, no longer Eastern Ukraine. Pretty soon there won't be a Western Ukraine. And of course, these massive attacks that have happened over the past 24 hours, leaving many of these cities in total darkness now, and hitting the intelligence infrastructure, hitting the energy infrastructure, taking out landing strips where these F-16s are supposed to be arriving, and the infrastructure related to the F-16s. Get ready. They can laugh all they want, but shit's about to hit the fan.
It also shocks me when people see like the U.S. Embassy warning warning embassies to not go anywhere, right, for 48 hours, and specifically says concerts in the sentence, that people still think that the U.S. is not somehow involved.
Yeah, how does the State Department? Yeah, great point. How does the State Department come out with a warning? Well, was it like a week and a half ago now?
It's like 48 hours before it happened.
Yeah, but there was a warning even like about a week and a half ago as well from the State Department. So it's like, America, stay away from concert venues, stay away from large gatherings in Moscow. Be very careful about this. I guess warning
but we
Americans.
Had nothing to do with it.
We had nothing to do with it, of course, right? Sure. To get up pretty early in the morning, if you believe that. I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. YouTube thinks that you'll actually like this next video right here. It's personalized based on your own viewing habits. So if you watch the video, please leave a comment. Let us know what you think about it. And we will see you next time, everyone.